Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Dina Okamoto. I'm the director of the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society. I'm also a professor in the Department of Sociology at Indiana University in Bloomington. I'm really excited tonight to introduce the Confronting Racism series. It's a 7-week program streaming on Tuesdays at 8 p.m. on Facebook. This series was inspired by the recent nationwide protests against police violence and systemic racism, and in support of Black lives. We wanted to foster conversations to help unpack the histories and social realities of race, racism, and anti-Blackness in the US. We also wanted to explore the modes of protest, resistance, and rebellion used to confront these thorny issues. We know that racism is entrenched in our histories, institutions, policies, and practices, and that it remains pervasive today, and we hope that this series can shed some light on the most urgent and important issues of our time. We also hope that this series can open up renewed possibilities for change. So over the next 7 weeks, we're going to bring together experts in the arts, humanities, and social sciences to discuss how racism and protest relate to a host of topics, a range of topics including urban geographies, like we'll hear about tonight, policing, media and technology, Indigenous perspectives, and also global systems. So we have a lot prepared for the next few weeks. I wanted to also note that this series is a collaborative effort between the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society, the Arts and Humanities Council, and the College Arts and Humanities Institute. It's also been supported and funded by the Office of the Vice Provost for Research and the Public Humanities Project. So we give thanks to those institutes. I also want to give a special shout out to Ed Comatale, Michelle Moyd, Deb Cohn, as well as the A&H and CREST staff for all helping to put this program together. It really takes a village, and we appreciate all of the help. So before I introduce tonight's program, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University was built on Indigenous homelands. So we recognize the Miami, the Delaware, the Potawatomi, and the Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. So tonight's program is about urban geographies of violence and protest. We have 3 panelists and 2 moderators. Again, we're super excited and we're so glad that you're joining us tonight. What I want to do is I'd like to introduce the moderators, and then in turn, the moderators will introduce the panelists and they'll get the conversation started. So our first moderator tonight is Michelle Moyd. She's the Ruth N. Halls Associate Professor in the Department of History. She's also the Associate Director of the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society here at Indiana University. She's the Associate Editor of the American Historical Review. She's also an expert in African and global histories and studies empire, the colonial state, as well as militarization and humanitarianism. Our second moderator is Jelani Ince. He's an advanced PhD student in the Department of Sociology at Indiana University. His research has been supported by the Ford Foundation, and his research focuses on race, culture, and the challenges of organizational change in the face of diversity in St. Louis, Missouri. So we're so excited to have Michelle and Jelani as our moderators tonight. And again, we thank you all for joining us. And I'd like to hand things over to Michelle and Jelani at this point.
All right. Thanks, Dina. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dina. Oh, sorry, Jelani. Go ahead.
No. I was just saying thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dina. And let me just echo the thanks to Ed Comentali and his team, as well as Deb Cohn and all the others that Dina mentioned who helped pull this together. I'm really excited to be able to do this tonight. And I thought I would just start with some introductory thoughts about where the genesis of this, this panel in terms of how we were thinking about the series early on. So 2 summers ago, I spent a week in Syracuse, New York, doing some research at Syracuse University. And while I was there, I became very interested in the geography of the city which made it feel virtually impossible to walk anywhere safely in terms of traffic patterns, pedestrian areas, etc. And this was made all the stranger to me by the fact that I'd often visited Syracuse by car while I was a graduate student in Ithaca, New York, which is just about or south of Syracuse. So I'd often pass through the city on my way to the large mall there and to go to the larger regional airport there. And on those drives, I'd often thought about the very interesting way in which the highway bisected the city so that one could look down from the highway and see the old urban neighborhoods on either side. But when I returned in 2018 and I had a little bit of time to explore on my own, I was really struck by how difficult it was to navigate this urban space. And some further digging revealed to me that Syracuse was one of many cities in the US that fell victim to the 1956 Federal Highway Act, which authorized, quote, authorized money for the construction of the interstate system. And I took that from an Atlantic article that came out in 2015, which does a really nice job of explaining this whole thing. In Syracuse, it was I-81 that destroyed certain sections of the city, viewed as, quote, expendable or blighted areas needing to be raised, unquote. Not surprisingly, these neighborhoods were often traditionally the homes of Black and Brown folks who had moved to places like Syracuse after World War II for economic opportunity. Their neighborhoods were destroyed to make way for US capitalist expansion, and generational poverty followed for many of those who were forced from their neighborhoods. During the protests in Minneapolis, St. Paul following George Floyd's murder by police on May 25th, I came across several tweets that referenced specifically the old Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul, which was another that had been destroyed by the building of a highway. Protesters had seemingly returned to that highway, I-94, as part of kind of an embodied memory of Rondo's past. And of course, there's much more to say about the racist outcomes of highway building across the US. This reminded me in turn of Dr. Rebecca Wingo's work with Rondo's Black historical preservationists, which you'll hear about tonight. And she's been a wonderful kind of co-conspirator with CRESS over the last couple of years as we've tried to build our own public history projects. When we were initially thinking about this series, I immediately thought of her work and how great it would be to think with her and others about how urban geographies have shifted over time due to various kinds of or registers of violence, as well as various registers of protest. So tonight we've brought together these three wonderful panelists to share some of their research, their insights from having lived and worked in various Midwestern urban spaces. And we'll start off tonight with a general question, just asking the panelists to talk about how their work intersects with the topic tonight. And each panelist will respond in turn. We'll follow that with 2 more rounds of questions and follow that with a short set of concluding remarks by Jelani Ince, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So with that, let's get started with some introductions. I'll start with Professor Rasul Mowatt, who is professor and former chair of the Department of Health and Wellness Design in the IU School of Public Health, Bloomington, and a professor in the Department of American Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences. And as of tomorrow, he will be a member of the Department of Geography, where he will be, where part of his appointment will now be. His primary research areas are social justice, leisure behavior, cultural studies, and critical pedagogy. And he's published on a range of things, a really quite impressive range of things, all of which are connected to critiquing society for issues that are most prevalent in impacting quality of life. So including racial geographies of public space, analysis of historical relevance, and among others. Next, we have Candace, Dr. Candace Miller, who is a postdoctoral scholar at the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society, and a visiting assistant professor at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. She received her PhD in sociology from the University of Virginia in 2019. Her research interests have focused on race, ethnicity, urban sociology, and culture. Dr. Miller is currently working on a book based on a mixed methods examination of the disparate impacts of gentrification on Black-owned and white-owned businesses in Detroit, Michigan. In addition, she's recently examined how arts organizations are distributed among poor and minority urban neighborhoods, how students from different racial groups construct spatial meaning and interpret a sense of belonging on a public university campus, and how race and gender create inequality in and among biology PhD students in laboratory workspaces. The last panelist is Dr. Rebecca Wingo, who is the Director of Public History and an Assistant Professor of Public History at the University of Cincinnati. She is the co-author of an award-winning book, Homesteading the Plains Towards a New History. She also edited an open access volume called Digital Community Engagement, Partnering Communities with the Academy, that just came out last week. And I'm told it's open access, and maybe she can say more about that in the course of this evening. It explores model practices and ethical challenges of academic and community partnerships created in part because of the work she's going to discuss tonight about urban highway construction. Her manuscript in progress, Reframing the Crows, Housing and Adult Education on the Crow Reservation, argues that housing policy was designed to restructure the relationships the Crow tribe had to the house, to the land, and to each other. So with that, let's get started. And as I mentioned, we will start with a general question, which really just asks the three panelists to talk to us about how their work, broadly construed, connects to the topic for tonight, urban geographies of violence and protest. So Dr. Mowatt, could you start us out?
Absolutely, Michelle, and thank you, Jelani. It's a pleasure to be here. Actually, if you don't mind, too, in terms of answering that question, I just would like to probably just read something out, and that kind of frames both my background as well as the sort of direction that I wish to take here. So, just as an opening point, is that okay?
Yes,
so,
that's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. So abolition. There was once the enslavement of Africans, and then there wasn't. As New Englanders grew wealthier from the slave trade and before the importation of the enslaved had become outlawed, New Englanders also began to cultivate a hotbed of abolitionist sentiment in this area of what would become the United States. Abolitionist newspapers and pamphlets sprang into existence and flooded colonies that became states, towns that became cities, and ideas that became movements. The propaganda they produced was numerous enough that by the 1820s, South Carolina instituted severe penalties for anyone bringing and even holding any written anti-slavery material in the state. The argument against slavery was that this was a social and moral evil. To prove their case that one person owning another was morally wrong, they first had to convince many in all sections of the country that the enslaved were human. So ideas turned into pamphlets, pamphlets turned into books, books turned into speeches, speeches turned into rallies, rallies turned into marches. When stated capitalism turned the black into a slave. So abolition, this first abolition, turned the slave into a criminal. So not because that this was the goal all along, but it was as far as the United States would be willing to go. So since Reconstruction and up to the 2020, we've been in the long struggle of the second abolition, making the criminal a citizen. Again, not because that is the goal, but it's really as far as the United States seems willing to go. And I'm hinting that a third abolition would be the final one necessary to move the human or the citizen to a human being. So for myself, extending my dear work, or my dear colleague, Nicole Siegel's violence work, the state legitimizes violence through the creation of workers. Violence workers can do violence, but they mostly operate with the threat that they can bring and they're allowed to exercise. So my extension of this focus on the locations of this violence work is what I'm calling the geographies of threat. Nonviolence does not mean that violence is not happening. Violence is just delayed in facilities and spaces of prisons, of housing, of healthcare, of education. The criminal must be identified, surveilled, detained, arrested, caged, killed, with killing always an option to jump to. So for the racial other, the police are always lurking somewhere in the geography of a city or any place lurking to do their violence work. So in the long era of the criminal would provoke the initiation of the proportionate rates of incarceration that would later cease from mass incarceration. So now in 2020, Terre Haute, Indiana, where just housing them can prevent the decay of a dying city, where one prison replaces another, where a smaller prison is built to become a bigger one. The presence of these spaces ensure that they will always be fed more criminals. If death has not already happened, it surely will. When we think about things such as even vigilante violence, This was the role of the red shirts in 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina, angered at the theft of a life that they felt the Black had stolen from them, running them out of the city into the Cape Fear River. And this extends my own work in terms of what I look at in terms of lynching. And then in 1906, in downtown Atlanta, quote, another ragtag collection of whites marched up Marietta Street to a barbershop across the post office. Armed with assorted weapons in their bare hands, the white men forced themselves to the shop, killing instantly. After vandalizing the shop and stripping the slain of their clothes, the white men dragged their bodies first from the shop. A short distance away, another was killed. The three corpses were heaped together at the base of the famous Henry Grady Monument, as if it was some sort of offering to white supremacy. In 1911, Baltimore Mayor Mayhew signed into law, quote, an ordinance for preserving peace, preventing conflict, and promoting the general welfare of the Baltimore city. The use of separate blocks by white and colored people for residencies was the first example of the restrictive covenants law of the United States. This law, informed by prior reports and accounts, quote, villainous looking Negroes who loiter, and vicious women hurling foul epithets at every passerby, foul streets, foul people, and foul tenements filled with foul air, that's Pigtown, until it could become another Pigtown for new gentry and for tourists. These locations are what public health scholar Kamara Jones accurately calls sacrifice zones, managed by what Peter Drucker dubiously called organized abandonment, until they are deemed ready for renewal. Jumping to areas such as Chicago and Chicago race riot, we even see cases and examples of children who also engage in this form of riot and protest against the very space of African-American people in Chicago. And thinking about New York, Robert Moses, the unofficial city planner of New York City, once stated in his biographer, legislation can always be changed, but it's people of color. These geographies of threat are locations of violence workers of all sorts do their violence work: lynching, massacring, rioting, sacrificing, abandoning, policing, renewing, and protesting. So what now and why now in terms of protesting? Is it because of an awakening of deepness of injustice, or is it just that we were broken at home? So what will next year look like? What will this anger look like? So statues are coming down, but museums remain, like those that are 8 blocks away from the church massacre. They're coming down, fails to maintain the attention of the actual reality of the second abolition, a population of people that are still but waiting to be citizens, a citizenry stuck in determining whether this is a failed state needing abolition or a broken system needing fragility. There is a chasm between these two critiques, and they will only grow further. This time is not the fire, but there was once apartheid, and then there suddenly wasn't. And so that's at least in terms of a frame of how I wish to sort of engage at least the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rasul. That was a great intro, and I want to hear more about those images in the Q&A. I have to start my video, sorry. So next we have Dr. Candace Miller.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. So what I'll do, of course, is tell you a little bit about or give you a brief overview of the research that I am currently working on and tie that to this very important discussion that we're having here today. And so really broadly, my research interests have focused at the intersection of racial, spatial, and cultural inequality, and what that has looked like for my most recent research what that's looked like is an analysis or an examination rather of the ways in which contemporary urban redevelopment efforts in Detroit, Michigan have shaped the experiences and outcomes of small businesses. And in particular, my research traces the disparities that emerge among Black-owned and white-owned businesses. And of course, that research was driven not only by an interest in the ways that context shaped the experiences of small business owners, in particular this context of gentrification-driven redevelopment that we see happening all across the US and metropolitan areas. But I was also interested more broadly in the ways that resources are distributed through urban space and the way that race factors into not only the sort of outcomes that we see, right, but also in the planning. And so one of the things that came out of that research was a sharper understanding of the role that anti-Blackness in particular played in urban planning, right? So we oftentimes think about all of the racial inequalities that sort of happen as a result of, right, or that are sort of perpetuated as a result of particular redevelopment strategies. But I think we haven't really looked a ton at, and that's what I do in my research, at the ways in which really anti-Blackness, as I mentioned, is embedded in the very planning. And so at the start of the process of redevelopment, right, and at the start of the various processes of redevelopment that we've seen over time, when we think about the history of US cities, right, at the start of that process is anti-Blackness, such that we continue to see, right, a reproduction of cities that really devalue Black communities, right, that really do not invest in Black communities in any significant or impactful way. And we're asking ourselves, why do we see that? Again, I just want to drive that home. It's because anti-Blackness is often folded into the sort of planning of contemporary urban redevelopment processes. And so, you know, my work also thinks about the ways in which that impacts Black community building. You know, again, across the, or over the course of history, we have seen Black communities respond quite resiliently, right? And I would love to talk more about the concept of resilience, but we see Black communities respond by continuing to build in spite of a lack of investment in this, and in spite of you know, of really sort of significant history of violence to those communities. And you know, that's become a really sort of important way of understanding what is happening in cities. And in my work, again, to return back to my analysis of Black-owned and white-owned businesses, right? What that has looked like is an uneven investment. When we think about businesses as being central to this gentrification-driven redevelopment that we see across cities, a really sort of uneven investment across Black-owned and white-owned businesses. And despite Detroit being a predominantly Black city, right, Black businesses just haven't received near their fair share of resources that have been shored up by these contemporary redevelopment efforts. And to tie that to our discussion today about violence and protest, you know, I think it's sort of intuitive the way that we understand the importance of small businesses in the sort of economic vitality of communities, right? But what we know about Black businesses, if we think about them in the historical context of Black movements, right, that they have been central sites of organization and mobilization for Black communities, right? These have been the places where folks have gathered in the past to communicate, to talk about, to gather resources, and to actually move the social movements forward, right? And after, you know, more than a half century of a lack of, or, you know, total disinvestment in Black communities, what we see are very few brick and mortar Black businesses that have survived, you know, onslaught of sort of attacks in the form of disinvestment to these Black communities. And so, you know, I have been, I'm sure as many of us have been, really sort of in awe of this contemporary movement, but I can't help but think about how a lack of Black strong Black sort of institutions, both nationally and locally. And for my part, right, I focus on small businesses, but I can't help but think about how that will sort of affect or impact the sustainability of this movement. To be sure, this moment looks quite different than what we saw in the 60s. But, you know, HBCUs, Black churches, Black businesses were such central institutions to that movement. And we just have seen, after decades of disinvestment, a weakening of those institutions. And so when I'm thinking about how my research is relevant to this moment, of course, you know, people are not only responding to these recent acts of, or to, you know, what has been an onslaught of quite violent attacks on Black individuals and Black communities more broadly, but they're also responding to, you know, decades of disinvestment in communities, which is, you know, also quite violent, both symbolically and in real ways when we think about all of the sort of resources that communities have been deprived of. But yeah, I just, you know, for my part, I've been thinking a lot about, you know, the role that Black businesses have played in past movements and how this relative lack of, in particular, brick and mortar Black businesses will shape the outcome and sustainability of this current movement. And so I really look forward to having or continuing to have a conversation about that over the course of this session, and also thinking about the ways in which my research connects to Rasul's and Rebecca's. So I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Candice. And yeah, we can definitely come back to resilience. I'd like to talk about that too. Okay, so next up is Dr. Rebecca Wingo.
Hello. So tonight I'm going to take a few minutes and tell you guys about two of the communities that I have had the privilege to work with in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Cincinnati, Ohio. They are both predominantly African-American communities that share the history of the highway. Highways are so fundamental to our daily lives that we forget that they haven't always been there. In the vast majority of American cities, highways used to be communities of color. The Treme in New Orleans, the 15th Ward in Syracuse that Michelle opened our conversation with, August Wilson's Hill District in Pittsburgh, I-65 in Indianapolis, Oakland, Charlotte, Baltimore, Detroit, Milwaukee, Miami, Philly, and Rondo in St. Paul, and the West End in Cincinnati. Cities across the country weaponized their arteries as they built white roads through Black bedrooms. And I'd like to go ahead and put up my slides now if I can. In Rondo, in the city of St. Paul, they used eminent domain to displace over 750 families and 125 businesses to build I-94. You were looking in that picture at their central business district turned highway. Can I go to the next slide? This one isn't the greatest of quality, but I wanted to show you just how close to these houses the construction got. They took out an entire city block here, and the residents actually had to petition to depress the highway so it wouldn't be running directly by their homes. And I heard stories from kids who grew up in these houses that you're seeing, and this one guy remembered that he would look across that gigantic chasm and just watch the houses go, and how heartbreaking it was. The next slide, please. Now, in the west end of Cincinnati, the construction of I-75 displaced over 25,000 citizens. So if you keep your eyes on that densely populated area on the left of the screen, when we flip the slide, it's the last one, it turns completely into highway. There's a series of befores and afters from a couple cities that will be linked in the comments. So my projects with Rondo and the West End have been community oriented. See, the children who watched their parents fight for the right of residency are now the community elders, and they remember. In each community, my students and I have invited people to attend what we call a history harvest. And basically, on a specific day, community members come to us with their artifacts. We take pictures, we record the stories, and then we add all of the artifacts to a digital archive. Then the community members take their objects back home. There is no acquisition, and unlike the Antiques Roadshow, everything is valuable. The result is an archive of important material culture as defined by the community. So people have brought a range of objects: scrapbooks, marbles, trumpets, vinyl collections, recipes, choir robes, hymnals, 100-year-old collection plates. The artifacts tell their own stories about the individual contributor, but collectively, they also tell the story of the community. So music, church, food, family. Reclaiming these histories is a form of protest, and their exclusion is a form of violence. The work that Rondo and West End residents have done to build their own spaces actively combats their erasure. The evidence of their past forces us to remember. In 2015, the mayor of St. Paul apologized to Rondo. Today, we acknowledge the sins of our past, he said. We regret the stain of racism that allowed so callous a decision as the one that led to families being dragged from their homes, creating a diaspora of the African American community in the city of St. Paul. 11 months later, police shot and killed Philando Castile. He was a son of Rondo. I've only been in Cincinnati for 2 years, but I've learned some new names. And if it's okay with you, I'm gonna let them linger in the air for a bit. Those of you, my colleagues and the viewers on Facebook, please feel free to add your own. Roger Owensby Jr., Timothy Thomas, Everett Howard, Samuel DuBose. Unlike St. Paul, no one has ever apologized to the residents of the West End. Instead, the city of Cincinnati approved a massive multi-year tax break to build a stadium for our new MLS team in the heart of the West End. The residents' taxes paid for their own displacement, including Mary Page, this 99-year-old woman who had literally never lived in another neighborhood. History does not have to repeat itself. That is a choice that we make over and over and over. And now that I've gone and made myself really mad, I'm just gonna leave that right there, and thank you very much for your time.
All right, thank you so much, everybody, for your opening remarks. I think that really helps to get the conversation started. And so I'm excited to hop into these next couple of questions. And so building off of what all of you have sort of shared in this first round, the next question I have for you all is a two-parter. So just bear with me here. So the first part is, can you talk about how violence is inscribed into the geography of urban spaces and what this means for protest behavior? And then secondly, what should activists and organizers be thinking about when it pertains to protest behavior and how it interacts with that history of space and place. And so I think we can just go in the same order as we did in the first round, and we'll hop in from there. So Rasul.
Yeah, Jelani, could you repeat the first part because it froze up while you were saying it?
Yes, of course. So can you talk about how violence is inscribed into the geography of urban spaces and what this means for protest behavior?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason why I was trying to give the frame of the first abolition and the second abolition, again, the first abolition ended up moving the slave to becoming a criminal, and then the second abolition is what we're still in, to move the criminal to becoming a citizen, is that the idea of violence is trying to target and identify the criminal. So criminality begs for the call for lethality to be pursued. And so where are the criminal housed? Can they be seen? Can they be monitored? Can they be contained? Can they be targeted? And this doesn't have to just be the state, but this can also be the general public. And for us, I just want to make sure, at least for me, because I deal with lynchings, I don't just think of protests in terms of sort of political positions that I may be in agreement with, but any sort of form of protest, and so it's public participation, which moves to protest, which could move to riot or strike, which moves to rebellion, which moves to revolt. It doesn't mean it has to go through that, but it can begin in all types of other places. So on one hand, when we think about the general public in terms of vigilantes, if we think about Will James in 1909 and his lynching in Cairo, Illinois, the lynching itself was just the grabbing of him out of his cell and killing him on the streets. After that was the other stuff. This was not the lynching. It was an event now. It was them tying a noose around his neck, dragging him down the street. His head comes off. Unfortunately, I know this is graphic. One part of the crowd grabs his head and places on a stake in a park. Another part of the crowd took his body and just left it into an alley for dogs to feed on overnight. That was a protest, right? The lynching was just that one moment of the killing. The rest was the protest because they felt that this criminal should not be treated in a way of having an arrest and awaiting a trial and potentially being sort of deemed innocent. When we now think about the state, we think about the design of certain communities, not just in terms of a police traffic stop like one of the images I have, but SWAT team units, helicopters, heavy assault units that are constantly being deployed with precision. So we think about people who weren't maybe even the target of the arrests being still killed by the police in their own homes, right? Because their communities are constantly under threat. So if you think about Ramarley Graham in the bathroom, Ayanna Stanley Jones laying on the couch, probably waiting for her grandmother to bring back Kool-Aid or something else from the kitchen. And if we then think about Breonna Taylor laying in bed after a long day of work, right? These individuals, either their apartment unit was targeted for a bust or the area was constantly targeted for a bust, and it's completely normal. So at least for me, I'm trying to think about criminality begs for lethality, so the natural environment is then always there to deploy a response to these potential criminals in some particular way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Candice, we'll be interested to hear your thoughts on the matter.
Yeah. So thinking about Detroit, the visible sort of markers of the lack of an investment that I talked about earlier in this space, I think is a daily sort of assault to folks living in the city. I think for anyone who hasn't been to the city of Detroit, right, it's quite stark. And it becomes even more stark, the level of deprivation that the city has undergone when you travel any of the major thoroughfares from one end of the city to the suburbs, right? So you would imagine that you feel as if you have been transported to another country, to another time, right? Just the difference in the investment in the built environment. And that's traveling along as I mentioned, any of the major thoroughfares in the city. But I think another thing that isn't discussed as much, because, you know, I purposefully didn't include images of the city in my presentation, for one, because I think, you know, it's been turned into what many folks refer to as ruin porn, right? There's this consumption of the sort of ruin of Detroit that I think allows people to think about it in terms of buildings, right, and built space, instead of thinking about it in terms of people's lived experiences, right? And that's really what's important about what has happened to the city. But one of the things that I think people often don't think about is that, you know, as a city or as city officials are choosing which spaces of the city to invest in, which buildings to renovate, right, what's often left out are major American landmarks, right? We think about churches that Martin Luther King spoke at, spaces that Malcolm X spoke at, really important stops on, you know, during the civil rights movement that are falling into disrepair at this moment, right? The city has not made those spaces a priority. And, you know, in my discussions with many Detroiters, right, that's really important because it signals to them, right, or it articulates the priorities of those political actors in the city, right, and certainly those private investors. And because there's such a strong partnership between public and private investors and developers in the city, right, I think there's a real sense among Detroiters, among Black Detroiters, right, that there has been a shift in both political and cultural power in the city, right? And so after all of these decades of disinvestment, right, the moment that we are in now, where there is some investment in the city, it's highly racialized, right? It's very sort of geared towards redeveloping or transforming the city into a desirable place for white people. And investing in things that are priorities for white folks in the suburbs and in other regions of the country who they're hoping to attract to the city. And so, yeah, you know, I think that there is certainly, on any given day, any number of sort of symbolic acts of violence in terms of what is invested in. But I think that becomes very real for folks because it matters in their everyday life. It matters the streets that they walk up and down. It matters, you know, which areas of the city are invested in and those that are not, right? It creates an even starker, I think, divide between, you know, in particular, affluent white folks in the city and working class and poor Black people in the city. So yeah, that's what I would say about violence and how that's inscribed on the geography. I think, as I mentioned, you know, I think in terms of how that particular geography then shapes protests in the city, right? I mean, we saw people marching on the highways, right? These very same highways that ran through Black communities during urban renewal, right? Marching on those highways very recently. And I think that's important. But again, I would just go back to, you know, what is concerning to me, even in a city like Detroit, which is a predominantly Black city, right? That, you know, I wonder how the sort of absence of a strong network of local institutions is really going to shape the sustainability of movement in the city, right? So when we think about those churches that I just mentioned that are falling into disrepair, right, that don't have the same level or don't have the same number of congregation members, businesses that exist through, you know, limited investment in the city, but don't have a sort of strong presence, and not because of a lack of effort, right, but because the community surrounding the business isn't able to economically support those businesses. And then I would just also say, you know, that we think about educational institutions, we think about other spaces of work and other spaces of organization that really just don't have the population to sustain them, haven't had any investment from the city, right, which has claimed for a very long time that it didn't have money to invest. So there's all of these sort of, I think, things that are rooted in a lack of a sort of strong institutional base that comes out of, and to be clear, that comes out of the Black community. So specifically, I think all of that is going to shape the way that this movement sort of unfolds, at least in Detroit and probably other cities as well.
Great, great, thank you. And yes, Rebecca.
When I think about how violence is literally inscribed into the geography of cities, I think a lot about road names. So down in downtown Cincinnati, there's a street called Mound Street. And it literally used to be an Indian mound. It got raised and flattened, and the artifacts taken to some museum back east. And now it exists only as a street name. But we are so ill-informed about our spaces. So when Philando Castile was murdered, protesters shut down the highway. They entered I-94 at the Lexington Parkway ramps and marched toward the Capitol. Those are the facts. What people don't know, though, is that the westernmost boundary of Rondo was Lexington Parkway. So Rondo was this really thriving, self-sufficient neighborhood because it had to be. Black residents weren't allowed to go on the north side of University or the west side of Lexington, or they would be arrested or beaten. It was a containment area as much as it was a very vibrant and strong Black community. So that symbology of where the protesters started their march toward the Capitol was just lost on most people. And in fact, when George Floyd was murdered, protests erupted across Minneapolis and across St. Paul. And in St. Paul, everybody congregated at Snelling Avenue, and they started marching along University Avenue toward the Capitol. This is a little insider baseball for people who aren't familiar with the geography of the cities, but that area at Snelling and University is also an area with a high density, predominantly Black population. So the point is that the protesters were shouting, "Remember Rondo," which is Rondo's motto. And they were shouting, "This used to be a Black neighborhood." It still is a Black neighborhood, but okay. And they were otherwise invoking Rondo. But the boundaries of Rondo were like a mile or a mile and a half away. And so I don't actually quite have the words to describe how I feel about this, but it's some combination of like a frustration over the lack of education about our own spaces, the spaces in which we live. Looking at any Black neighborhood and assuming it's Rondo, it turns Rondo into this euphemism for Blackness, which further erases its own very specific history. Like, Rondo's not a metaphor, it's a lesson. So you asked how violence was inscribed into the landscape and what it means for protest behavior. And I guess at the very core, I'm basically arguing for more education, to be more informed about our own spaces and our places. And I think the reason for that is because if we acknowledge our past, we have to reckon with it. And in the case of these communities in highway construction, we literally just build on top of that history and cover it up and assume that just because we erased it from the landscape means we can also erase it from our memories. So.
Great, thank you so much. Y'all broke that down really well. So I'm already mad and enlightened already. So the next question that I have gets to a topic that all of you covered at some points, and so I'm really excited to see what you all have to say about this. So can you speak about what resistance to violence and the creation of positive, meaning-making projects within urban communities looks like within a society shaped by white supremacy? And so I'm curious what you all have to say about that. So Rasul, do you need to repeat the question again one more time? Did I break up?
Very good.
Okay, great.
So one of the concepts that I mentioned is organized abandonment. Organized abandonment by Peter Drucker is actually developed as a management suggestion. So similar to broken windows policing, organized abandonment is a way in which the city can sort of identify a location that's undesirable and abandon it, right? So limit resources, access to services, and so forth. So certain communities, of course, that are over policed, that's the only encounter that they have with the state, because they barely get trash removal, barely any snow removal, because it's part of the organized abandonment to reduce the cost. So this leaves oftentimes these communities just left to themselves to, fend for themselves in some ways, right? So this gets to another concept of that is sort of conceived of and thought of by Tamara Leach. She's at IUPUI, and this concept of pockets of peace. So in these communities that are oftentimes labeled as highly violent, right, quote unquote, all of these acts of murder that are happening, well, how come then these 2-3 blocks have no reported criminal activity, right? Nothing, right? And also around these particular communities, there are no churches, there's no community center. It's because the neighborhood residents themselves have figured in their abandonment that all we have is ourselves, right? And so that's one of the things that we can sort of look to. And so in the midst of some of these protests that we see, not only are there people sort of rallying and engaging in marching in different locations, but you have certain places where they're occupying spaces or facilities. So in Minneapolis, they took over one particular hotel that was abandoned and converted one half of it into a clinic, because of course hospitals were overflown, overblown with in terms of COVID cases. So people who were needing other types of treatment didn't have access to it. And the other half of the hotel was being used for a shelter for people who are facing homelessness. And you see this happening in other places, both here in the United States as well as other places, this occupation of abandoned facilities and converting them to sort of mutual aid centers. The other part is then also what we occupation of a space and using the space to sort of provide their own framework of democracy. Because of course, outside of this, they're saying that democracy has failed, not only this particular community, but us overall, as especially during this time of the pandemic.
Thank you so much. Candace?
Yeah, so, I think one thing that I was really heartened to see, and one thing that actually became surprisingly central to the meaning-making processes among many of the Black business owners that I spoke to in particular, was a sort of centralization of sort of Black history, Black religion, Black spirituality, as a way of reframing and or creating or generating a new perspective on their lived experience, right? So for many business owners, a paper that I'm working on right now, for many business owners, right, in lieu of profit, right, the way that they sort of justified continuing to operate businesses, starting businesses and continuing to operate them, was by seeing it as an extension of a broader sort of Black legacy of business ownership, right, and community building. For many of those business owners also, right, it was really important to create and maintain safe spaces for Black people. And then for others, right, they saw this also not just as an extension of a sort of legacy of Black business and community building in Detroit, but they also saw it as an extension of a sort of entrepreneurship and commerce and the broader sort of African diaspora, right? And so these were all ways for people to make sense of owning a business, even in situations, right, that weren't profitable, where there wasn't sort of profit on the horizon. And we, you know, I think that speaks also to a broader sort of shift among folks who are involved in other sort of aspects of Black community building in Detroit, and I'm sure, again, elsewhere, is a sort of recentering, right, of alternative perspectives, right? Ones that are not rooted in sort of dominant ways of thinking and being. And I think actually, you know, we have seen that to some extent, of course, also I think in Indigenous communities, right? Detroit has a significant Indigenous community as well, and they have been articulating, many of the folks who are in leadership in that community have been articulating similar things, right? I mean, there's tons of open space in the city, right? And so folks are returning back to sort of engagement with nature and with growing food and farming and agriculture, et cetera. But this is all a sort of shift away from a dominant sort of idea about how a city should be, right? And how folks should interact with urban space. And so in general, I think ways of resisting violence and creating positive meaning making for racial and ethnic minority groups, right, really, I think at the sort of basis just involves a reframing and reintegration of alternative perspectives. And, you know, and being really specific about that, and being also, I mean, you know, as members of you know, various racial and ethnic minority groups, also allowing ourselves to take seriously other racial and ethnic minority groups' perspectives as well, right? And so I think that that's one really interesting thing that's happening in Detroit, and that's really been, I think, central to people sort of remaining hopeful in some really, really dire sort of conditions. I think, you know, I always tell people that I think most folks would be shocked at some of the realities of living in the city of Detroit in terms of, you know, things that we take for granted and come to expect our municipality to provide for us, right? That's not always available in the city, and I think people have made do and sort of remained hopeful by, you know, constructing alternative ways of understanding and meaning making.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. And Rebecca.
I think that violence comes in many forms, and it, as a historian, I'm just going to say we do often repeat ourselves, right? So I think that communities often can draw from their very, very deep history of trauma in order to find ways to resist to the modern. So like there's a lot of choices that city planners can make, right? Including the displacement of Black and brown communities. So in my community, like the decision to build the MLS stadium in the West End stands as a really, really good example of just more of the same in like a different costume. So like, you know, dear city planners, like your Groucho Marx eyeglasses and mustache just aren't going to shield what you're doing. Displacement is displacement. So our coded language becomes like urban renewal becomes revitalization, but it's all just gentrification, right? Unless we stop it. So I've seen some really interesting forms of resistance to that. And so when you think about the spaces of Blackness, you have to think about that geography infiltrating so much more. It translates into everything else, like a united political power of communities of color that stands as a threat to white supremacy, the economic viability and stimulus of these communities, access to transportation, public and social spaces, and just a laundry list of other things. And I'm sure that Candace has way more expertise in this than I, but just one example that I saw in the Rondo community was the formation of a land trust. So their land trust has literally halted gentrification in its tracks, right at the midway point. So as speculators were moving in from the east, from the Capitol building, they were moving west into Rondo. The land trust started moving in from the west. So they kind of just like met right in the middle, and you can literally see the dividing line. It's Dale Street. So on one side of Dale, you've got bike kitchens and yoga studios and a vodka bar. And then on the other side, you've got these mom and pop stores and my favorite coffee shop, Golden Time Coffee, where the owner has basically transported New Orleans into his coffee shop, and he runs the Jazz Fest every year. So he's integral in like keeping the community going. And so the land trust is vested in resistance. And they do so by only allowing businesses that serve the community that's already there, rather than the community that is hoped will move in. Mm-hmm. So, you know, whatever resistance ultimately looks like in any one community has to be defined by those community members. And the perpetrators of the violence, a lot of city planners and a lot of people who go to the polls need to recognize that they are indeed the perpetrators of this violence, and then involve the community from the get-go. So that stretch of I-94 that goes through Rondo has to be rebuilt. It's 50 years old. And so the Department of Transportation actually was like, okay, we know what we did last time. This time, what would you like us to do as we reconstruct this stretch of the highway, knowing that the highway has to stay there? But what would you do instead? And so they formed this big consortium of people, and they ultimately decided that they would like to try and put a cap over the interstate, a land bridge that would literally reconnect their old neighborhood. It's called Reconnect Rondo. And so there's these fascinating ways in which the community is resisting even 50 years on to the same problem that was before.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody, for sharing your insights. I'm going to share a few remarks really quickly, and then I'll pass the baton to Michelle for the Q&A. And so one of the things that I was thinking about as we were talking, I was reflecting on a New York Times article that was released by Caroline Williams that referred to her body as a monument to the Confederacy. And while I won't get into the details of her argument at this point, I think given what we discussed, I was struck by the importance of language, specifically labeling and naming places, people, and memories. And I'm intrigued by this metaphor of a monument. I think this is something we can gain. There's something we can gain from this image. So very often during these moments, right, that we're living in right now, there's speculation about what to do, how to move, and or how to respond. And so getting to sort of the comments that were raised earlier, so Rasul, I was really moved by your language of geographies of threat, particularly the racialized meanings attached to what we consider a threat to be. Candice, I appreciated your points about anti-Blackness, and that is embedded in neutral words and phrases like planning, but also the charge to focus on sustainable, enduring tools of resistance. And that's going to stick with me even beyond our conversation this evening. And Rebecca, I really appreciated your comments about a shared history of highways, right? How our roads are intimately tied to displacement of Black and Indigenous peoples, and how they are artifacts that tell stories of a community, what it values, what it excludes, and what it chooses to remember or erase. And so space, as we know, is incredibly important for group identity, social cohesion, and also remembrance. And so organizations are key terrain for this and are necessary to accomplish some of the extra individual goals we've been speaking about this evening. And so while we champion the necessity of removing physical monuments to the Confederacy, I'm thinking that we should also consider the importance of questioning the discursive monuments in the form of like cultural narratives. So narratives of rugged individualism, narratives of a country organized around principles of equality for all instead of the color line, narratives that frame the inequality and violence that sort of pervades our urban communities as natural or inevitable. And although like these sorts of monuments are not so easily grasped with our physical hands at times, I think a physical response is required to dismantle, to imagine, and to build the future that we need. And so whether it's the pursuit of diversity or understanding urban geographies or engaging the politics of protest, I think without a sincere rejection of a history that is sort of organized around power and unequal relational dynamics, and also a commitment to continue that work, if we don't do that, I think we're going to find ourselves woefully underprepared and asking ourselves the same questions in the very near future. And so I think the question is not about a matter of maybe what to do, but if we have the will to do what is necessary for our communities. And so with that, I will conclude. Thank you again for sharing your insights, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Jelani, and all the panelists for really rich remarks.
Say that.
I'm my child wants to be a part of this too. So, so yeah, I'm going to turn to a couple of. Well, actually, I wanted to ask a couple things myself, or maybe just one before I look to some of the questions that have come in from audience members. So Candace, raised the issue of resilience, which is a term that I think gets used quite a bit to refer to communities, abilities to sort of continue on in the face of horrific violence, dire conditions, everyday life conditions. And I was thinking about resilience in relation to Rasul's evocation of apartheid, right? Like the sort of long-term, decades-long instantiation of structures of poverty and violence that nonetheless people somehow get through, right? And so I wanted to maybe give the panelists a chance to talk about the different valences of that word, resilience, and how it features in, again, in this kind of, in thinking about urban spaces, violence, protest. What do we make of that word?
Yeah, so I actually, I think while I was speaking, was having a sort of internal dialogue about whether to use the word resilience. A dear friend of mine who is also a sociologist, Catalina Vallejo Pedraza, who does really fantastic work on reparations. She and I have this, reparations in Latin America, she and I have this really, this conversation quite often about whether or not to use the word resilience and whether or not it does more harm than good, right? I think it is true that Black communities have responded certainly time and time, and other communities of color as well, but Black communities in particular have responded time and time again to what we know to be an onslaught of attacks, both in urban and rural spaces, right? And somehow they survive till now, right? And I don't know if that's, the issue that I have with resilience, right, is that it sort of displaces, right, it takes away the sort of emphasis from the violent actor, right? We're thinking about how someone responds or how a group responds to something rather than the violent act. And so that's why I hesitate often to use that, because I think, yes, it is worthwhile, and I hope actually that we do get to the point where I, as a person who studies racial, like racial, African Americans in particular, but racial inequality, can start to focus more on the sort of positive aspects or the sort of aftermath or positive responses to things that are happening, rather than constantly diagnosing issues. But I think that that's important. I think the emphasis should continue to be on the violent acts, right? And not, I mean, it's important to acknowledge how groups respond, but I don't ever want to take the emphasis or the attention away from the violent acts. And so that's why I kind of hesitate to use the term resiliency, because I think that we just need to continue to emphasize that. And I think that's actually something for all of the work that we all do, right, that doesn't get enough attention, right? We have not spent enough time thinking about the actual nature. And I'm so excited to find out more about Rasul's work because, you know, I mean, as a person who is a consumer of that work rather than a producer of knowledge around lynching, right? It's always been quite fascinating to me how people are not honest about what lynching was and how it was actually consumed by white people, right? That this was like a form of entertainment, almost like a festival. And so when we think about how communities responded and survived in light of lynching, right, that's important. But let's spend a lot more time thinking about the act of violence that is lynching, and the real nature of that, which is, you know, it's violent, but it's also speaks a little bit, I think, or we should spend a lot of time thinking about the psyche of the groups who participated in something like that, and what are, you know, like, what does that mean for today, and how do we see that playing out today, and, you know, how did we arrive at this moment where someone, you know, did what they did in Minnesota for 8 minutes, seemingly unbothered, right? Well, we've seen that before. There are no shortage of images that that we can find on the internet today of lynchings of the very same attitude, right? So yeah, I go back and forth about whether or not to use the term resilience often, because I don't want to de-emphasize these acts of violence.
Yeah, Rebecca, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump in since Candace sort of passed the mic to me in terms of sort of looking at lynchings more deeply. And so I think that's one of the things that Candace was trying to invoke, knowing how they occurred and why they occurred. And so I think some of the work of Tone and Beck is highly important in understanding lynchings, because they talk about these two concepts of deterrence and sort of this way in which a lynching was done to sort of prevent certain actions from happening elsewhere. And then the other term, which, you know, I'm in a fog, we're trying to remember, but the other idea is, if a lynching happens here, contagion. If it happens here, it will prevent other lynchings happening in nearby towns and cities. And so people who were doing lynchings knew of this because they were trying to, you know, stop or control the social order or the movement of people. So either they were trying to deter behavior of a population, or they were trying to influence other places in certain ways. So that's why bodies were displayed in certain, you know, locations and this type of thing. And so I think knowing these cases is important, but also understanding how we have to sort of strip away certain trends and certain types of language. I know a lot has been made about I Can't Breathe. Most recently, articles have come out in terms of looking at past cases in which I Can't Breathe has been invoked. But if we think about Eric Garner, he was saying a lot more before his sort of I Can't Breathe refrain. And one of his most striking words so him in saying it stops today is what we should be actually remembering more of, and not necessarily the I Can't Breathe part, but we're given this narrative, and I Can't Breathe sort of moves us to a place of just pain, of just sort of reaction, whereas It Stops Today gives us this sense of struggle. And so a lot of what we're talking about in terms of protest, the academic book kind of closes and the struggle book has to open up. And again, because Candace sort of opened that doorway, we have to know these cases of these shootings. There's so many, right? And so it's very easy. Any one of us, so instead of just saying the name, know of how they died, right? Know of how they were killed, because then that gives us a sense of the wrong, the injustice, and that directs how we are choosing to sort of make that same sort of stance of it stops today, right? And so I think we have to sort of get into this space because there's a lot more names than just a given. And I know in some of my own walks for exercise and so on, you see the same groups of names being sort of used everywhere. And now Breonna Taylor's name is added to that list, but there's so many other names that are forgotten, and we don't know the complexity of their cases when we sort of invoke their names. And if we're going to sort of honor their memory and use their memory for fighting, I think we should sort of have that understanding of the cases, but being careful about language.
I'm really glad this came up as a piece of the conversation, because I think that words are never neutral, right? And so in the case of resiliency, especially, when I'm trying to find the right words for this, but like resiliency seems to be some sort of inalienable quality inside of an individual. And so that was like the one thing that white people couldn't take away from communities of color. And so they turned the word, right? Oh, look how resilient you are. Like, we're so surprised that you survived. And so the word has been taken in a way that I think at one point, at least within, I'm immersed in Indigenous scholarship. That's my background and training. A word that was once sort of taken by communities to prove their existence, to prove their resilience, to prove their inner strength, right? So that word's somehow been divorced or manipulated as a way of sort of creating a commentary on surprise that the colonial state didn't work. And so in a way, like resiliency being that inner inalienable quality also is a little bit passive, right? So it's resiliency versus resistance. And so when I think of resiliency, I think of like all of my friends of color who are like, you know what, I'm real tired, and I think that it takes, like, its existence takes energy. Like the existence of any sort of resiliency in a person takes so much energy because it's under constant attack. And so I'm not sure how to really piece apart that word, but I'm so glad we're having that conversation because I feel like in my book that I'm writing right now, I might use it too much. So thank you.
I definitely feel that last point you made about resiliency taking energy. Thank you all for those responses. So I'm going to turn to a question that came in from a viewer, Dan Johnston, who I think, if it's the same Dan Johnston, is a friend of Cress and also a geographer. And he asks, in thinking more broadly of the so-called urban, the suburban gets thought about in reference to white flight and is often coded as white space, where the urban is considered non-white space. In the current movement, there have been a number of protests in suburban places, but the suburbs have been referenced as what reduced policing looks like. How do the panelists see urban geographies of violence and protest supporting or challenging this traditional division of space and place? Does anyone need a recap?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, so he's essentially asking about how the suburban is constructed versus the urban. And in the current movement, there have actually been a number of protests in suburban places, but the suburbs have been referenced as what reduced policing looks like. So, the suburbs are better off because the police are less interventionist in certain ways, right? How do the panelists see urban geographies of violence and protest supporting or challenging this traditional division of space and place?
I think to some degree, if we look at history, at least maybe almost literally 100 years ago, so 1918, 1919, and 1920, when we're looking at protests and riots that were put upon populations of color, specifically Black populations throughout the United States, the city center was important. as a location for the protests to happen, right? And then we then begin to see this sort of long period of time in which protests and sort of riot or maybe even strike was happening in the sort of pocket neighborhoods in which people were in. And this is primarily because, of course, as I sort of mentioned earlier to Jelani, public participation precedes protests. And so we also see barriers to engage in public participation. You can no longer just go and ask, your mayor or city council member a question on, at the monthly or weekly meeting, because of all these sort of structures that are in place, both in terms of paperwork, but also in terms of just the general time of the meeting, as well as the actual physical barrier itself of getting into these locations. So when we then jump to a suburb period where in terms of, people moving out of the city and into other areas and trying to create their own sort of micro cities because the major urban areas were failed, the problem is that the suburbs didn't pan out for all of their practical needs. And so this is why then there's a retaking of the city. But now I think we're in the midst of a struggle for that city, right? And we've seen this in all types of communities, right, across the United States. And so the protests are now, there's a confluence of one particular sort of perspective trying to take over the city center. And there's another sort of population of people that are coming in that are also trying to sort of lay claim to public spaces. And in the midst of that is the sort of state having its own sort of interests, between these two sort of populations. So I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but so I do challenge that sort of notion and idea. So in thinking about, it's much like 100 years ago with the city center being.
Candace or Rebecca want to weigh in?
Yeah, sorry. I think that just the end of what Rasul was saying got cut off for me, at least. But I just
Me too.
Okay, just to piggyback off of that. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have as much of an answer to the question, but I would agree. I think with Rasul in that I think there is a lag in our sort of understanding or conceptions of the relationship between race and urban and suburban space, because we do know that suburban areas are becoming a lot less affluent than they have been, right? And they're becoming there are many more racial and ethnic minorities moving into suburbs in this moment. I don't know as much about what the response and policing has been in those spaces, but I do know, I mean, if we're thinking about Ferguson, right, which was a suburb, that the relationship between the Black community and police looked a lot like it has looked in a lot of city centers, right? So I think to the extent I would imagine, or I would sort of guess that to the extent that there is some noticeable increase, in particularly among Black residents in suburbs, that the level of policing looks similar to that of any other predominantly Black space. That you are as likely to be over policed as a Black person in a suburb as you are in urban spaces. So yeah, I'm for as much as I can remember of the question, that's what I have to say, and I think that relates much again to what Rasul said. We just, our understanding is lagging a little bit behind the realities of the urban and suburban spaces in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Candace.
Yeah.
Rebecca?
I don't have a whole lot to add to that, other than cities are constantly this ebb and flow of popularity, right? Whether it's popular to be in the city center and it's popular or not. And the populations shift with that, and the police shift to where the populations go. But I also share a slight trepidation. I think that I've seen a whole lot of protests pop up in suburban spaces, many more in city centers. And I think that, people in the suburbs are feeling like they got to contribute somehow. And I just am a little worried about the performative nature of it. And whether or not that show of solidarity and the show of support is something that can be sustained past people's boredom in quarantine. And I truly, truly hope that it is. But as a historian, I'm probably not going to be able to see that for another like 10 years. So this is how we work.
Yeah, I mean, I would just throw in there too that, I mean, it's really interesting to think about suburban spaces when Black folks live in them and they're not the majority, and how they are always perceived as out of place, right? And that's how we get the murder of Trayvon Martin, and it's how we get this ridiculous case in St. Louis right now, right, of the two extremely wealthy white folks standing outside their palazzo with firearms, right, and agitated and worried that they're about to be invaded by this group of protesters. So it's really, I also think it's interesting to think about that dynamic and, you know, what happens when Black folks or brown folks are perceived as being out of place and how vulnerable they are in those classically suburban spaces, right? So let's see, we had one other audience question, and this might be the last one unless panelists want to, you know, engage each other on anything. So this is a question that's specifically asked to Candace, and it is, does the type or variety of Black business play a role, or do different businesses play different roles in galvanizing social movement?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. So my research, of course, didn't directly engage social movements. But what I will say is that I think that what we see in addition to far fewer sort of brick and mortar. So part of my, part of the sort of paradox that I was trying to address also in my research, right, is that there's been increasing sort of attention to the rise in the number of Black businesses that exist in the US, right? So the federal agencies have touted the increase among Black businesses, and a number of publications, including Black publications, have touted this increase in Black businesses, right? But we don't see that on the ground. And I was wondering what are we missing? And so one of the things that I found in one sort of in the quantitative aspects of my research was that, you know, there has been a lot of growth among Black businesses, but it's really been in sort of home-based businesses, right? We can think about this also as an extension of this rise in the gig economy, right? People are working from home more. People are doing or participating in the gig economy. People are, just, you know, having small businesses. We don't see a rise, and in fact, we see a smaller share of brick and mortar businesses, and in particularly businesses that have employees, right? And so we have to think about the implications that has for the community. If we're thinking about businesses as central to Black community building, then it matters if that business has developed to the point that it has employees, and then that it has developed to the point that it has a non-sort of residential physical space, right? Those are the types of businesses that really anchor communities and sort of ward off a lot of the sort of encroachment that happens with gentrification-driven redevelopment. So I think in that way, the type of business matters, whether it's an employee business or a brick and mortar business, right? But if I'm thinking specifically about sort of businesses as anchors in Black communities of Detroit, one of the interesting things that I've also found, right, is that businesses that catered to, Black businesses included, right, that catered to this sort of imagined you know, group of newcomers who would soon arrive in the city, right, and be new consumers, right? Businesses that catered to those folks were the businesses that seemed to be the most likely to get some of these like resources that came out of these sort of development sort of purses, right? And so, you know, if you were gonna open a coffee shop, good for you. If you were gonna open some sort of art-based business, right, that would sell sort of cultural and lifestyle goods, good for you. The city seems more than willing to invest in that in many cases. If you were just trying to do something that was maybe sort of more rooted in the local community in terms of its sort of working class or poor characteristics, right? Sort of like, certainly like racial characteristics, that seemed a lot less attractive, right? Because, you know, their investment in the city, both public and private investment in those businesses was really part of a larger strategy, right, to transform the city into something that was more desirable. And so businesses that maybe provided day-to-day subsistence goods to folks who were working class and poor were just not part of that plan. And so, you know, but those are things that obviously are needed. I mean, Detroit is a city of food deserts, right? There are very few sort of large grocery stores, certainly chain grocery stores in the city. And so when we're thinking about something like a grocery store, right, I was shocked in the sort of 3 years that I was in the city that that no black owned grocery stores had opened up. And there had been a number of like arts-based Black-owned businesses that had opened up, right? And, you know, again, not because of a lack of effort, those businesses oftentimes ended up being, you know, really unsustainable because the community was just not interested in the types of products that they were offering. And so I guess, yes, the type of business, I think, as it relates to its sustainability does matter in that way as well, right? Because if a business is unable to survive, it doesn't sort of mature to the stage where it becomes a sort of strong political actor, a strong space of sort of like mobilization, something that anchors the community. So, yeah. But that's a great question, something that I've been thinking about more, you know, given all that's going on.
Thanks, Candace. So we're kind of at the end of our time, but I do want to give the panelists one last shot at either things they'd like to maybe draw out of other people's remarks or final thoughts. Jelani, if you have anything you want to add at this point or questions you like to pose, maybe we can do one more round before we call it a night. So anyone? Any takers?
Well, I'd just like to start by thanking both of my co-panelists. I really enjoyed listening to what you had to say. You made me think a whole lot. And Rasul, your idea here of organized abandonment has been like resonating with me very much. And that's something that's not going to leave me for a while. So thank you.
Just for me, and it probably opens the doorway for future parts of this series. I hope definitely listeners sort of think about the entire sort of 6-week or 7-week run. For me, as a sort of newcomer to a Department of Geography, not just thinking about the in real life space, but the digital space, which is something I know we didn't really, sort of get to, but digital spaces as places of occupation and performance. And so what we see there, especially, is this tension between sort of digital narcissism, so places in which now you have tons of photos that litter, a Google search that, blast the faces of many of these activists. Work of civic journalism that's appearing in digital spaces, and how civic journalism is how we're finding out about these cases and these situations when we're not from that local area. So how do we know of what's happening in Seattle if we're here in New York or Indianapolis or Miami or Toronto or any other place in the world. And so digital space is something that is there, and much like the actual physical space, there's cases of gentrification, there's cases of occupation, and so definitely look forward to sort of taking both my colleagues' sort of approaches and thinking of things, and also applying it into this sort of new area of digital spaces.
And 3 weeks from now, I think it's 3 weeks from now, we will have one of these will be on the digital, the technological, et cetera. So yeah, thank you, Rasul. Candace or Jelani?
Yeah, I'll just say thanks also for, I'm really very pleased to have been a part of this, and certainly learned lots from both Rebecca and Rasul, and also Jelani with his takeaway. And so, yeah, I'm really glad to have been a part of it, and hope to also keep in touch with everybody who's here today to talk more about this. There's lots of interesting.
Yes. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Candace. It was great to hear more about your work. Jelani, any final thoughts?
No, apart from I just immense gratitude for all of you for your labor and expertise. Yeah, and I'm definitely going, now my mind is spinning to think about how to incorporate these things in my work I'm doing right now. And so I will definitely be following up with you all via email. But this was great. This is really, really helpful, and I hope it empowers folks who tuned in, and those who will see the recording later. So
wonderful. Yeah, so I want to echo that. Thanks to everybody who tuned in tonight and helped us get this off to a good start with your questions, and hopefully this sparked some new ways of thinking for all of you. And I'm sure that if you have further questions that you want to direct to any of our panelists or to me or Jelani, or that you know, our emails are widely available through our university website. So do feel free to get in touch. Yeah, and again, thank you to the Arts and Humanities Council team for running this tonight. And we look forward to seeing you back in this digital space next Tuesday night at 8 o'clock.